Peace be with you. It's kind of a habit, isn't it? Do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? There's probably no more profound gospel than the one that we read today, in some sense leading us to our identity. Now, Jesus for sure knows who he is, but he's living in the first century at a time when the chosen people had forgotten who they were. There's three things that I want to point out from today's gospel. The first thing is the goodness of God. The second thing is the importance of remembering where you came from and where you're going. And then how in life and where in life to remember that. First of all, the goodness of God. Notice here how for the last 3 weeks we've been reading about these parables that Jesus is addressing to these particular religious and pseudo-political groups in the first century, because he wants to lead them to a deeper reality than the one that they've grasped onto as an identity in their life. Today we hear from two more groups, the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians. The disciples of the Pharisees were people connected, obviously, with the Pharisees. They were a religious group. They had a good thing going in the temple because they're the ones that regulated, as I've said before, what was considered kosher and what was not considered kosher, and they could certify it. And therefore, because they had that power, they became corrupt, and it became more of a service about money rather than worship of God. The Herodians were similar. The Herodians and the Pharisees would not have been friends because the Herodians believed that Herod, who they followed or who they were from the family of, believed that his power was maintained by Caesar, which it was. In order to keep that power, they had to make sure that Caesar, who was considered a quasi-god, was placated. He was pleased. And so here we have two very different groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, with very different visions of the world somehow uniting in opposition to the Lord. The Herodians had things to lose. They would have said, yes, you have to pay the tax to Caesar. Why? Because if you don't pay the tax to Caesar, he'll be upset with us and we'll lose our power. They were compromised by power. The Pharisees, as religious people, said, we are the chosen people. We ought to have no one govern us but God, and therefore do not pay the census tax to Caesar. But notice how Jesus becomes a uniting force because they believe they have a common enemy. Because Jesus wants to bring them to a more profound reality that would, if they listened, make them more unified. And so knowing their malicious intent, these two groups approach Jesus and they pay him lip service. You know, this is what that means. We're not concerned with anyone's opinion, for you not regard a person's status. Then what is your opinion? We believe you're a truthful man, Lord, but it's sort of like saying, you think you know everything? We've been arguing about this for a very long time since Rome came to power in our area. You tell us what you think. They're setting him up. It's malicious. They want to hurt him. They want to hurt goodness itself. Well, eventually they'll put him on a cross. But notice how Jesus responds with goodness. He does ask them, why are you testing me? But his answer to their malicious intent is not dismissive. He answers their question. The goodness of God is important to remember in this because in order to end the cycle of sin, the cycle of maliciousness, someone in a sense has to play the victim or bring things back to reason, or make them understand a more profound reality that they may have forgotten. And we're coming to that. My mother passed away about 5 years ago, and She had very few things that she said in regard to religion. She was a very faithful Catholic all of her life. In fact, she grew up Lutheran, actually. And for some reason, her parents sent her to a Catholic school. Now, in the 50s, she was in a broken home. Her parents were divorced. Her stepfather was an alcoholic. She never quite understood why her parents sent her to Catholic school. But indeed, they did. They had my mother so convinced. Well, we'll say that my mom, in all the problems she had at home, her response, rather than to running out and doing something destructive, was to go to the church and to pray. So here we have an 8-year-old Lutheran in the Catholic Church praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament. In school, they had her so convinced that Jesus, because of the way they simply spoke, Jesus is in the tabernacle, this is Jesus. Like we say, 50% of Catholics don't believe it now, statistics tell us, because we've stopped talking and acting like it. But they had her so convinced that Jesus was present in the tabernacle. More of our mature parishioners remember when the priest said Mass facing the altar. And so she was so convinced that Jesus was in this tabernacle that she would be in her pew and she would lean around like this when the priest opened the tabernacle to see if she could see Jesus standing in the tabernacle. I don't know if she was expecting to see his head or what, but they had convinced, she believed it. And she went there in the midst of her problems to pray about them, to figure out how to somehow find meaning in it. And that's what she did. She never knew why. And one of the things she would always remind her young son and sons, she had 7 of them, was that you come back from God, or you come from God and you go back to God. And what you do in your life in that time determines where you spend eternity. And then she would just kind of leave it at that. If we weren't listening, she'd say, I gave you the word, and that's it. There's no more. You come from God, you go back to God. And what you do in that time is where you'll spend eternity. So when we hear the test that they give Jesus today, we hear it coined in the phrase of coins. Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar? Why are you testing me? You see how they give Jesus this, you're a profound teacher. We know that you're so profound. We have a really shallow question for you. What does he do? He deepens it. Why? Because those Pharisees, those Herodians, the Pharisees especially as keepers of the law, should have remembered something. Genesis, the very beginning of the Bible, what they would have called the Pentateuch, the most revered book in their history, says in chapter 1, verse 27, male and female he created them. In his image and likeness he created them. And so when Jesus asks for the coin and he says, whose image is on this coin? What do they say? Caesar's. And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God's what is God's. Those coins were minted in Rome by Caesar at the time. They were sent out through the empire to be used in exchange, and eventually through taxes, they went back to the emperor. So the question we have here, if Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, what is created in his image and returns to him, and render unto God what is God's, then what is it that we are to render unto God? Chapter 1, verse 27 in Genesis. Male and female he created them. In God's image and likeness he created them. Time out. I've learned on not be distracted, but... So that's it. Genesis 1:27. Male and female he created them. In his image and likeness he created them. Friends, if human beings are created in God's image and likeness, then you and I are God's coins. You and I are God's currency. Notice what isn't said about that coin of Caesar's. You know, when a coin gets passed around, pennies especially, what happens to them? They get tarnished. But do they lose their value? No. Jesus was sent as the Savior of the world in order to recover God's currency, to recover his people, which are you. We are God's coins. How often we forget. Who are you? Really? Not a shallow title like Herodian or Pharisee. But at the very core and the depth of your reality, who are you? No matter how you may feel you've been passed around in this life, no matter how tarnished you may feel from living the burdens of what life brings, that you're always meant to be rendered unto God. You, but that also extends to every person next to you. How do we practice this? Well, I have a question for you. The last time somebody pulled out from you in front of you in traffic, did you render that person unto God or unto somewhere else? See how easy it's to forget. When our identity becomes more about what we're doing and less about giving deference to what others are doing, we forget to render unto God what is God's. And this happens in a lot of areas of life. There's two, and one in particular that I want to bring out, and two facets of that, and that is social media. Several years ago, I had received an email that it just was very simple. It was one of these, this plus this equals this. Anonymity, which means no one knows who I am, plus an open forum on the internet, social media, social chat rooms, everything else, equals jerk. You know, it didn't say jerk, it said something else. But there's small children present, and so I'm not going to say that. Do you forget that beyond that screen name, beyond your own screen name, there is a face? There is a person. There is an image. There is a coin. There is a soul that is meant, even though tarnished, meant to be cleaned and returned to God. More laws today are being enacted in order to actually persecute people who use social media to convince them they're worth less than what God says they are. There's the case of the young woman who convinced a young man that he needed to take his own life. Maybe many of you saw this story on the news. So oftentimes the problems that we look at in our society are not the problems of what's wrong. The problem is what's missing. The same thing that the Pharisees and the Herodians forget in today's gospel are the same things that we forget. We attach ourselves to titles rather than underlying identities. So the question is then, how do we remember? We've got to read the Scriptures. Pharisees forgot that. They got wrapped up in their own life, and they forgot the life that God had for them. And secondly is prayer. Prayer is sort of like, for many people, a car pulling out in front of you, because it interrupts your life. But I can tell you for certain, in all the prayer that I have said in the last 12 years of my life, I was a new prayer 12 years ago, I have never once, not once, left a time of prayer regretting that I had done it. I can tell you before that time, I regretted a lot of other things that people told me I wouldn't regret. But I have never once regretted praying or reading the Bible. So friends, today that's the encouragement, to remember who you are in this gospel, that we are God's coins, endowed with dignity despite the tarnish, valuable to God. And we ask us to treat ourselves and our neighbors also as the same. And when we forget, reconciliation is the great scrubbing. It's the great shining of who we are as baptized Christians. And so, friends, today let's remember who we are.